Let's take a trip to an American supermarket. Coming through the doors, we're overwhelmed by choice. So it turns out that Ritz, Wheat Thins, Nilla, Premium Saltines, Oreos, and a bunch of other stuff are all owned by Nabisco. Basically every major industry in America, and I'm sure more broadly in other countries too, is controlled by like 2 to 4 companies.
So, because a company decided they could make a profit by offering you a choice, that means you don't really have a choice? You're a special kind of stupid, ain't ya?
%60 of cereal is sold by the top 2 companies and 85% by the top 4.
Here's a question. 60% of what? How are you quantifying that? By sales figures? By number of items on the shelf? You don't say, which I find pretty suspicious. But either way, it seems like this is all based on consumer demand. When consumers buy cereal, 30% of the time, they buy Kellogg's. Or, based on sales figures, stores devote that amount of shelf space to them, or whatever. And you want us to conclude from this that we don't have a choice just because a bunch of people chose one brand. Do you really not see the fatal flaw in your argument?
Almost everyone uses either Windows or Apple OS on their computer.
So, they could use Linux if they chose to, and those who make that choice do. How does that mean the choice doesn't exist?
And almost everyone has either an iPhone or a Samsung phone.
I don't. Wasn't even that difficult to get. What's your point? Maybe Apple and Samsung are just really good at coming up with features a lot of people like. So what? How does that mean we don't really have a choice?
This really creates friction with the idea that you have so many choices and that they're all vigorously competing against each other with only the best destined to succeed and all the worst destined to be weeded out.
In what way? Maybe those companies that are most successful really have succeeded, and those smaller companies are just being weeded out. In what way does the observation falsify the claim?
In the Pixar canon, there's a company called By and Large.
Really? You're gonna look at cartoon makers for support? I'm not nitpicking here. He spends the better part of 2 minutes of the video on this point, in only a 12-minute video, and uses it for support.
It kind of feels like if you take capitalism to its logical extreme, you end up with something like By and Large.
Why? Because you say so? Of course, by your own admission, you're basing this on your feels. Not even that, just your kind of feels. So what is this evidence of other than your own bias?
Once a company reaches a certain size, it gains advantages that make it all but impossible for new companies to successfully compete with them.
Yes, we're seeing this yet again. Some socialist moron bleating on about economies of scale without even understanding what that concept is, while completely ignoring diseconomies of scale.
Let's say, for instance, that you wanted to have a ketchup startup. With 54% of the market, your biggest competitor, by far, would be Heinz, a division of Kraft Heinz. Heinz, first of all, would be able to invest far more in product development than you would, so they'd be able to churn out new products at a much faster rate.
Yeah, ask me how I can tell you've never run a business in your life.
And since they make much more ketchup, about 1.8 million bottles a day, economies of scale would also come into play.
Economies of scale refers to a decrease in cost per unit as the quantity of production increases. Here's what that looks like. At low levels of production, the cost per unit is high. As the quantity produced increases, the cost per unit decreases. But notice 2 things. First, a subsequent increase in quantity doesn't decrease the cost per unit as much as the previous increase did, and there's a point where it actually starts to turn around and go back up. That's the point where the diseconomies of scale start to outweigh the economies of scale. You are not going to hear about either of those aspects from morons like the Lucretia Report.
Managers of restaurants, for instance, often don't have control to choose whatever brand of ketchup they like because their company.
I don't need to go any further with this sentence. The restaurant is the company. If you run a restaurant, it's your company, and you can buy whatever ketchup you damn well please. He bleats on about Heinz having an exclusive contract, but that's because the restaurant chose to enter into that contract, because they'd get a better deal that way than with whatever other options were available to them. But again, just because they did choose that way does not mean that no other choices were available to them. At some restaurants, you can get Coke products. At others, you can get Pepsi products, because those restaurants made the choice between those two companies when they made the contracts with their respective suppliers.
Finally, there's the issue of advertising. It doesn't particularly matter how good your ketchup is or how cheap it is if no one's ever heard of it, which is not a remote possibility since you may be able to spend $10,000 in advertising and Heinz may be able to spend $10 million or $1 billion on advertising.
Now that's an interesting claim. If everything works the way you say it does, why does Heinz need to do all that advertising? Do you not see how you once again defeated your own argument? At any case, not all advertising is the same. You're comparing Heinz advertising worldwide to a startup advertising in a local area. But that's exactly how Heinz started out. Henry J. Heinz was born in Birmingham, Pennsylvania, to a poor family of German immigrants. He got by working at a food packer in Sharpsburg when he decided to create a business, Heinz Noble and Company, bottling horseradish. It went bankrupt after 6 years. So he joined a business, F&J Heinz, run by his brother John and cousin Frederick. It didn't do very well either. 12 years later, Henry bought the business and reorganized it, creating the H.J. Heinz Company. It was just a local company in Pittsburgh, but it did well. This is what we keep seeing. Successful companies only come about after a string of failures. Sometimes it takes a while to get it right. In Heinz's case, it took 20 years of his adult life. 17 years after that, he was able to incorporate H.J. Heinz and, far from riding some mystical wave provided by Lucretia's warped version of economies of scale, Heinz became successful by pioneering various innovations which made his product attractive to buyers, most notably regarding food sanitation. He also gave his workers unprecedented benefits that meant they could work more cleanly and attentively, and he could deliver a superior product. This is something else Lucretia misses out on. He's just coming up with this hypothetical scenario where all ketchups are alike, and now you have to compete with Heinz somehow. But how are you going to compete with them if your product doesn't offer any advantages? You'll have to do what Heinz did. Come up with some way your product is different that actually matters to consumers. In other words, you have to give them a choice.
All of this comes together to mean that once 2 or 3 companies are established in an industry, it becomes all but impossible for any new companies to become major players in that industry.
It's hilarious that you're actually saying this when an earlier example you gave was T-Mobile. It used to be the big 3 were AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint, and morons like you kept bleating that it was impossible for a new player to come in and compete. And then T-Mobile sauntered in and did just that. For that matter, I remember when the big providers were Singular and Cellular One, and competition with them was supposed to be impossible.
And the bigger these companies get, the harder it becomes for new players to enter.
You mean new players like Microsoft that had no hope of competing against IBM? Or Facebook that had no hope of competing against MySpace? Or AMD with no hope of getting market share over Intel? What about all those retailers who had no hope of competing against Woolworths, but eventually Woolworths lost market share and went out of business entirely?
But as long as these companies have cash or shares, they can still buy other companies and get even bigger.
Exactly how do idiots like you think that happens? You can't just magically buy a business by throwing a bunch of money at it. The owners have to agree to sell it. And if it's publicly traded, you have to get the stockholders to agree to it. It's not any kind of straightforward thing like you're making it out to be. You're just using it as a brush off, nothing more.
Have you ever noticed how it's no longer the dream of every startup founder to become a big company, but to get bought by a big company? By Apple or Meta or Alphabet?
And do you know what that's an indicator of? Let me give you a little history lesson. Back when J.D. Rockefeller was trying to increase market share for Standard Oil, he kept buying up smaller oil companies. But the more of them he bought up, the more oil startups there were. And it was exactly as you said. People were creating oil startups hoping to sell to Standard Oil. So what was Rockefeller really doing? He was creating a market for oil startups. And the more he bought them up, the more were founded. It was absolutely unsustainable. And that was exactly the point when Standard Oil started losing market share. And here you are, being the pathetic ignoramus you are, pretending like that's a way to maintain dominance in a market.
How even the golden capitalists of Silicon Valley have accepted the fact that no new players are allowed to sit down at this table. When our players first sat down at the table, maybe there were many more. But hand after hand, some people got more chips than others, and some were knocked out of the game.
As laughable as the rest of your bleating is, it's mind-boggling for you to say this about tech companies, which, as I've already pointed out, absolutely do not work that way. Look at how few people use Tumblr these days, and how many use TikTok.
During the American Gilded Age, before they were broken up by antitrust laws and lawsuits, our capitalist system allowed companies like Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, American Tobacco, and the American Sugar Refining Company to become unquestionably dominant.
Funny how all of these companies lost most of their market share before the antitrust actions. Did you not even look this stuff up?
Those companies were broken up because when one company gets so large and has so much power, it's unchallenged, and it can offer whatever products or services it wants, at whatever quality it wants, at whatever price it wants. It can pay its workers whatever it wants, and no one can say anything about it because they have no choice.
Yeah, they used to say that about Kodak.
The competition and choice that's supposed to make sure that the consumer is first completely withers away. And we see that again happening today with companies like Amazon, Tyson Foods, Luxottica, and Facebook.
Amazon and Tyson have plenty of competition. Luxottica competes with a bunch of internet eyeglass companies, and Facebook has been losing market share to other platforms like Snapchat and TikTok for years. And I repeat, Facebook once faced the monopoly of MySpace, which was being called a monopoly, and morons like you were calling for antitrust action against them. I'm gonna link again to an article that says exactly that. MySpace is a natural monopoly that no company has a hope of competing with. It even mentions Facebook.
Amazon today has 6 times the market share of the next leading e-commerce site.
Whereas it used to be eBay dominating over Amazon.
Prime Video is a close second to Netflix.
So they're still playing second fiddle to an independent startup that started the online streaming portion of its business the year after Amazon added theirs? Again, I don't think you realize how much you just destroyed your own point.
They have Amazon and Ring smart devices. They are building their own internet system and preparing to offer delivery services like UPS and FedEx.
So they're adding choice and competition?
The promise of neoliberalism and free market capitalism was that we would have healthy competition that would ensure innovation and mean that we got the best products at the best prices, and that everyone would have a higher standard of living.
And that is exactly what's happened.
But over time, we're seeing that the very cutthroat free market competition that they said would give us so many choices is taking away our choices.
Except you haven't actually shown any examples of that. The examples you have shown completely destroy your own hypothesis.
As we here languish in the ruins of a declining empire. Because this is the inevitable and unstoppable result of the capitalist system. The only real solution is to choose a different road altogether.
A road that, every single time it has been tried, has led to misery, starvation, and societal collapse. I know which one I choose. So thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, and go to donate.bogosity.tv to keep me doing what I do. And check out all the great content here, like this video selected just for you.